Look behind almost any rock god who ever commanded a stadium, and you'll see it standing there. A black wall of amplifiers, stacked like a fortress, one gold word burning across the front. Marshall. That name stood behind Jimi Hendrix the night he set his guitar on fire. It loomed behind Clapton, behind Jimmy Page, behind every kid who ever wanted to sound loud and a little bit dangerous. It didn't just make rock and roll louder, it became the face of it. And then, in January of 2025, this symbol of British rebellion was quietly handed to an investment fund from China. The price? 1.1 billion euros. But here's the part almost nobody tells you. The man who built this empire of sound never trained as an engineer. He spent nearly his entire childhood frozen, unable to move, sealed inside a full cast of hard plaster. This is the story of how a boy who couldn't even stand up gave the world its loudest sound, and how, in the end, it slipped through his family's fingers. All of that power, the sold-out arenas, the billion-euro name, the sound that rattled the back row of every stadium, none of it was born in a laboratory. It was born in a hospital bed. Picture a small boy in a London between the wars, lying perfectly still, wrapped from his chest to his feet in hard plaster. He stayed that way for nearly 9 years. No running, no playing, just stillness and the hum of the ward around him. When he finally walked out, he was a teenager with no real schooling and not a penny to his name. He never learned to read a circuit. He was no scientist, no inventor. He was a drummer, a man who kept the beat for dance bands and taught kids how to hold a pair of sticks. And one day, almost by accident, this drummer would build the machine that gave rock and roll its roar. To understand how a boy who spent his childhood frozen ended up rewiring music itself, we go back to the working streets of London and a name the world had not yet heard: Jim Marshall. He earned more money teaching children to tap their feet and beat a drum than most working men in London made at a proper job. Think about that. A boy who'd spent nearly 9 years locked in plaster, who walked out of that hospital with no schooling and empty pockets, was now the man other parents sent their kids to. But let's rewind to where it truly begins. James Charles Marshall is born in 1923 in a hard working-class corner of London into a family that knew the value of every coin. Then, at just 5 years old, the doctors find tuberculosis in his bones, and they seal him in that cast for the better part of a decade. When he finally emerges, he's a teenager with a stubborn streak and no obvious future. So he improvises. He tries tap dancing. He sings on small stages. And then he sits down behind a drum kit, and something clicks. By the end of the 1950s, he's not chasing the spotlight anymore. He's teaching. And one of the kids learning from him is Mitch Mitchell, the boy who'd one day drum behind Jimi Hendrix himself. Here's the strange truth. The man who would arm the loudest bands on earth started out selling drums to schoolboys. No grand plan, no vision of stadiums, just a teacher who knew his market. Teaching paid well, better than the stage ever had. So in 1960, Jim Marshall takes the next step and opens a small shop on the edge of London. He calls it Jim Marshall & Son. The shelves hold one thing: drums. He buys them in bulk, marks them up, and sells them straight to the very students he's been teaching for years. It's a tidy little business built on a simple fact. He already knew every drummer in the neighborhood by name. There was nothing here that whispered revolution. No amplifiers, no guitars, just a drummer running a drum store. But those drummers had a habit of bringing their bands along with them, and the restless young guitarists trailing in behind them were about to ask Jim Marshall for something he didn't even sell yet, something that would turn this quiet little shop into a legend. The men who would soon deafen entire stadiums walked into that little shop complaining that they couldn't be heard. That's the irony at the heart of this story. One of the regulars is a wild young drummer named Keith Moon, and he starts dragging his bandmates in with him, a sharp-eyed guitarist called Pete Townsend and bassist John Entwistle. The future of The Who, browsing for gear in a drum shop. And they all keep circling back to the same frustration. The amplifiers they can buy are either too weak to cut through a roaring crowd, or they cost a small fortune. The good ones come from America, stamped with the Fender name, and priced far out of reach for skint British kids chasing a sound. Jim Marshall listens, and he hears something the big suppliers across the ocean keep missing entirely. These young players don't just want power. They want power they can actually afford. A roar that doesn't cost a year's wages. And right there, behind the counter, Marshall decides he's the man to give it to them. So a drummer with no engineering degree set out to build the very thing the giants of the industry sold for a fortune, and to sell it for a fraction of the price. That decision becomes the backbone of everything that follows. The idea is almost rebellious in its simplicity. Real volume shouldn't be a luxury reserved for the rich. It should belong to any kid with a guitar and a dream. In 1962, Marshall puts two clever hands to work, an engineer named Ken Brann and a sharp young talent called Dudley Craven. They study the American designs, then rebuild them around British parts and a British budget. The first one to roll off the bench is called the JTM 45. It's cheaper than the Fender, but it doesn't sound polite. It's rougher, dirtier, hungrier. And to a generation itching to break the rules, that grit sounds like freedom. Word spreads fast. The orders pile up so quickly that the man who started with a single drum shop has to open a factory just to keep up. One guitarist looked at the loudest amplifier Marshall could build and said the same thing every legend eventually says. It isn't enough. Make it bigger. That guitarist is Pete Townsend again, and this time he's chasing a monster. He marches in, demanding a 100-watt head and a towering cabinet, something powerful enough to bury the screams of an entire crowd under a tidal wave of sound. Marshall pushes back. It's too much, too unwieldy. But Townsend won't let it go. So Marshall gives in, and out of that stubborn demand, something completely new is born. An amplifier head set on top of two enormous speaker cabinets rising up off the stage floor. The Marshall Stack. A black tower nearly as tall as the man playing in front of it. For the first time, a band doesn't have to shrink itself to fit a smoky little club. It can fill an arena. That looming black wall becomes the new measure of loud, and the new look of rock itself. A man who spent his childhood unable to make a sound ended up defining the loudest noise in modern music. Let that sink in. Once that towering stack appears on stage, the floodgates open. Jimi Hendrix builds a wall of them behind him. Eric Clapton does the same. So does Jimmy Page. An entire generation of giants lines up their backline in black and gold, and the image becomes inseparable from rock and roll itself. By the 1980s, with a model called the JCM 800, the Marshall name isn't just the voice of rock anymore. It's the thunder behind heavy metal, too. What began as a sideline in a little drum shop has turned into something close to a law of nature. If you're playing a serious stage anywhere on Earth, that black tower is standing behind you. And the press needs only 3 words to sum the man up. They start calling Jim Marshall the father of loud. From a hospital bed to the top of the music world, the empire is at its peak. But peaks never last. Every empire has one person quietly holding it together, and one day, that person is gone. In 2012, Jim Marshall dies at the age of 88. The father of loud, the boy from the plaster cast, the drummer who armed a generation. Gone. For a few years, the company stays in the family's hands, but the ground beneath the whole industry is shifting. The real money in sound is no longer up on the stage. It's slipping into people's pockets, into headphones and portable speakers. The roar of the amplifier is being replaced by a quiet hum in someone's ears. And in 2023, Jim's family makes a choice that would once have been unthinkable. They sell the company to a Swedish firm called Zound, a business that, until then, had only made headphones under the Marshall name. For the very first time, the family that built this legend no longer holds the reins of their own name. The name that screamed rebellion from every stage on Earth now sits in a spreadsheet owned by people who never plugged in a guitar. Here's how the circle finally closes. In January of 2025, a Chinese investment fund called Hongshan buys control of Marshall for 1.1 billion euros. The family is left with little more than a slice. The brand that was born to give cheap, honest power to the kid who couldn't afford it has become a line item in an investor's portfolio. And more, the talk is about headphones, not amplifiers. The sound still holds up. The name still earns respect. But that first stubborn question, who are we really building this for, doesn't echo the way it used to. And maybe that's the quiet lesson here. When you stop building for the people who believed in you and start building only for the next big number, you risk trading your soul for a price tag. So chase your dreams, but stay good to the ones who got you there. Never let the empire turn you into someone you wouldn't recognize. So here's what I want to know from you. What's the one band, the one song, the one moment where a Marshall stack gave you chills? Drop it in the comments right now. I read every single one. And if this story hit you, subscribe and stick around, because the next legend we uncover might be the one you least expect.